Morning, everyone. Welcome to the, I think we're still in January, meeting of HCD, first of the year. Welcome. Good to see so many people here. Hopefully Keith is on his way, but we're going to go ahead and get started with approval of the minutes. Any questions, comments? A second, and they are approved. Second thing on our agenda is the Community Development Department update, and I think most folks know this. This is a written report that we get, and we treat it just as Keith is dealing with a medical issue with a family member, so he will hopefully arrive, but has told us to get started, so we will do that. We have done that. Yeah, so this is a written report, and we typically don't go over it in detail. It's just updates on the many things that the department is doing. I don't have any questions about it this month. You don't either. Okay. Paul, anything else you want to add? Anything new that's changed since you put the report together last week?
So just one quick announcement that we added a new member to our community development team. So Emily Ball, if she doesn't mind standing up, she is our new HMIS coordinator. She'll be working with Brian Husky on the homeless issues. We're really excited to have her as part of our team very, very much.
That's great. Welcome, Emily. Emily you're an old timer on these issues here, and we are very, very, very lucky to have you. Yeah, you and Brian are going to be an unstoppable powerhouse, I know. Anything else? Okay. All right, then we will dive into the meat of the meeting. We just have one agenda item, and I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, but my guess is this is why so many of you are here today, and I'm, again, very happy for that. Kathy will go over this a little bit more, but folks who've been in this process know that we have been talking about changes to the strategic partnership process for at least 2 years, changing criteria, just looking at a whole host of things with an eye toward really trying to target this funding in a perhaps a more effective way, both in terms of the organizations that receive it and in terms of the work that's happening. And I will add that a new element that has become equally important, maybe almost equally important, is the staff time that goes into managing this process and the agreements that come out of this strategic partnership fund process. So this is not a new conversation. Many of you have been in it, again, with us for a couple of years. I think we're to the point where we really do want to try to move forward with some recommendations to council. So just to set the stage today, we will be taking a vote on this and moving it forward to council. So we will be having public comment on it. Kathy will do a presentation, we'll have a little bit of conversation, and then I'll open it up for public comment, and then we will go from there. So, Kathy, thanks.
Chair Mayfield and members of the HCD committee. Again, I'm Kathy Ball, Assistant City Manager for the City of Asheville. And thank you, Chair Mayfield, for kind of providing a preface to the presentation. And it won't be much of a presentation, except to talk about the fact that we have been looking, to repeat what you said, we have been looking at trying to adapt the requirements for the strategic partnership funds so that they're clearer for folks to be able to apply for, that they're more equitable. So these recommendations have had the eye of the Equity and Inclusion Office as well. And as you mentioned earlier, they have looked at the staff time required to process, maintain them. And so we're coming forward to you today with a number of recommended changes. And again, as you mentioned, we would I'll bring these up, and we would like for either whether it be the preference of the board to be able to vote individually or to vote on each one of them separately, to be able to move this forward to City Council on February the 11th. As you're aware, this is a process that we do every year. The pot of money is about $240,000, as it will be this year. So we are in a little bit of a crunch to be able to get the guidelines out to those folks looking to apply for these funds with the requirements. So our goal is, after it goes through city council, for us to be able to put this out. I would also say that typically on any given year, the CDBG funds are done at the same time. We have already released the applications for the CDBG funds. So those will not be held up as part of this, or will be done at a little different schedule, which is not the way that we typically have done it.
And that was, as I recall, one of the recommendations from the equity office that came to us last year, was to split these two.
Yes.
up.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first one. The first one is limiting the number of years that organizations can receive these grants and limiting it to 5 years. Staff recommends that the first year of this requirement be the year that we're in, to give folks time to be able to adjust and find other sources of funding. So that would be the first recommendation. This is intended, and again, this goes back to the equity inclusion, it's intended to help folks start up and then be able to help them become reliant on other sources of funding.
So can I ask a question about that? Recommends that the first year of this requirement be fiscal year 21, which is, again, the year, well, it's not the current budget year, it would be the next budget year.
It will be the year that these awards
That's
are
right,
made.
So does this mean that year one, if somebody gets a grant this year, that's year one, or are we looking back essentially? So if an organization has gotten grants for the last 5 years, they would not, are we saying they would not be eligible?
They would be eligible.
They
So
would be
year
eligible.
one would become FY '21.
Okay,
Because that's when we would start the clock, in order to give people time to adjust, because they're new. They may be counting on these funds for this year, and they may have received them in the past
Right.
5 years.
okay,
We feel like we want to transition to help our
Yeah.
partners as best we can,
okay.
but also to be able to help other organizations as well.
Okay, and so if, again, so nobody would be ineligible for the funding based on this criteria, but next year, if you've gotten funds for 5 years, you would not be eligible.
And next year would be year one, so you would have to look out 5 years before you would be
Everybody's
ineligible.
clean.
We're starting
now.
Right. So after 5 years, you would not be eligible for these funds anymore. And again, the purpose is just to help folks, give people plenty of planning time to be able to transition. That's staff recommendation, and of course, this is for you all to decide. Limit on the organization's total budget. One of the things we saw when we looked through the equity lens is that we are trying to help folks who have a limited budget, have a smaller budget. So we're recommending that if your overall budget is more than $1 million, you would not be eligible to receive this fund starting in this year.
But you can apply for CDBG.
You can, absolutely. The third one is that the amount of the grants would be given out in increments. So as opposed to what we've seen in the past, sometimes we will have grants for $1,333 that we're administering, and we probably are spending as much staff time administering those. And we're not saying they're not valuable to folks. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying that when people apply, they would apply for one of these increments of funding, and the awards would be made based upon that. The fourth one is, and this is something that you all discussed last June or July in your meeting. One of the biggest needs that we see in the community is closing the opportunity gap. And so we would recommend that all of the applicants demonstrate how they're able to close the achievement gap within their application.
And did you find whether that was
It was not a vote.
It was not a vote, it was just
It
sort
was
of a head nod?
suggestion, talking about head nod, but it was not a formal vote.
Okay, all right.
Now, last year, this committee recommended that we touch base with the leaders with Asheville City Schools to make sure that there was some reporting system for organizations and schools. And I believe that they sent some recommendations, but I'm not sure that we knew in total what the recommendations were. Will we have that beforehand to use that
Yes.
as a guide?
Yes. And if you look in your packet, there is information and staff reports from those meetings that specifically relate back to getting some kind of a scorecard. There are various ways to close the opportunity gaps. I don't know that it's totally related to the school, but in the event that that our partners are working with the school, we are asking them to get feedback from the schools on how they are partnering and whether or not they knew. If you remember, previously we'd asked the school if they knew of some of the organizations. In some cases, they said they weren't aware of what they were doing. So that's the gap that we're trying to close, is to make sure they're partnering with the school system. The last two is that staff would not move forward applications that are not complete. And in saying that, I should have put that up there. We are committed also to providing the committee with the full initial application, so that as it moves forward, we may work with the applicant to try to make it fit or be able to demonstrate some more measures that we can account for on outcomes. But we are going to provide the committee with the initial application so that you can see that as well. And that's been a request of council members. And that staff will make recommendations on funding. So in the past, staff would evaluate them and give kind of pros and cons. Now staff will make recommendations on the funding. So I don't know if you all would prefer to vote on these individually, that we can move it forward. I know you want to take public comment before you do that. And we will be prepared to respond however you need us to after this.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. Do you have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So, limiting the number of years that an organization can receive strategic partnership funds. I don't know that that's grown on me over time, but when we put that up against closing the achievement gap, I don't believe that a 5-year cap will give us enough time to really assess if our money has really given us the outcomes that we need to see. The opportunity gap, it's been a prolonged process, and it didn't happen overnight. So I'm not sure that a 5-year investment will help us really get where we want to get with our children and as a service provider.
I understand what you're saying. I'm wondering if we say these are guidelines and that the committee could evaluate them and be able to determine whether or not an organization was moving closer to achieving that. So that at least there's a time frame that our partners are shooting for. If they continue to demonstrate that they're able to close that achievement gap and they're working toward it, I think the committee could recommend approval.
Especially if a person is taking advantage of our capacity building classes, and they're really working in alignment with our expectations and what we recommended. But things can happen with programs, with staffing, with cost. Just kind of taking those contingencies into perspective, we might get an applicant after the 5-year mark really be able to outline to us why another year, another 2 years would be acceptable, and we can all agree. So I don't want to be locked into this. So I agree it should be kind of like a guideline.
I like that. The sort of the default is the 5-year limit, and then if they want to make a case for how our investments are continuing to advance, and that they're in the middle of a program and just need to continue to need our investment. I think that's fine. I think part of the goal of a lot of these is to try to build up organizations so that they can move to other sources of funding, but sometimes that's not always, that doesn't happen very quickly. So I like that idea.
Because if we can see and chart their performance growth, and I believe if they make the case, then we should be leaning there.
Yep. Other questions? Okay. And I'll catch you up in just a second. Do we know, Paul, how many, in terms of the second proposal, how many of our current grantees would exceed that budget threshold? I've done a kind of an unofficial count. I come up with about 5 or 6.
Of the total 27, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
Yep, that sounds about right, but I've not looked at that data.
Okay. All right, so welcome, Keith. Hope the casting went all right. So we're going through each of these suggestions and recommendations from the staff, and just having a quick conversation about each of these. The one bullet that Shanika just suggested that we amend, and I agree, is on the first one, the 5-year threshold. So that would start, so everybody's slate, everybody starts with a clean slate for this fiscal year. And it would go, those years would count forward going from now. Shanika's suggestion was that there sort of be a default of 5 years as the max, but then we can continue to award funding if we feel like that's appropriate. So it's not a hard stop at 5 years necessarily. And I think
What's the largest amount we gave out last year, 2022?
I just looked at that.
I can look it up while you all are discussing.
I just looked. There's a 21. There were two grants at 21,667. That was Youth Transform for Life and Christine Avery. No, my daddy taught me that. Christine Avery was 20. So those were the top 3. And then it dropped down, well, then there was a 16. So yeah, those were the top 3. Yeah, and Paul, maybe when we get to the council, when this moves on to council, if you can have that information about what organizations. I'm sure we will hear from some of them today. And I invite you to let us know if you would fall at that threshold, if you would exceed that threshold, just so we know what we're doing.
I'm looking around the room, and I know the recommendations came from community development and equity and inclusion, but I don't see a representative from equity and inclusion here to be able to speak on any of the recommendations.
We do have a memo from them from June.
I mean, I have.
That talks about a couple of, talks about a couple of. The other thing before we open it up for public comment is the capacity building. Again, did you go back and look at whether we made that a requirement or just a recommendation?
It was similar to the discussion that happened around the closing the achievement gap, where there was a lot of discussion, but it never moved forward to a full recommendation of making that a requirement.
Okay. All right, well then I would like to put that on this list as well, as making it an actual requirement. And I think we could go back and look at it again, but I think it applied to groups that were that received a grant in excess of $10,000. Yeah, and I can't remember if there were any other requirements on that, but again, if part of our goal is to be lifting up smaller organizations and helping them build capacity so they can find funding in other locations, I think that's really important. So, all right, does anybody have any other questions before we open it up for public comment?
Just to speak to that piece, I know a lot of organizations are working on capacity building right now. So if they're seeking other agencies to help them with that, that qualifies.
Yeah, I think so. We just, I think, we can help make opportunities available, but if groups are in some other program or taking advantage of, other offerings, I think that showing is fine. But if we're going to require it, we do have an obligation to make it available.
Because I think at the time that we did our community survey, I think the strongest positive around that piece was that they were able to opt in. It's kind of like a voluntary thing. And I think that gave, that probably had the most positive feedback. And the reason I'm just kind of thinking it out, because a lot of organizations would say that they don't have time to take on any other responsibilities outside of meeting with our staff to make sure that their application is ready to be presented towards council, and actually in the minutia when you find time to take another class.
Yeah, it is the most challenging thing for small nonprofits to find the time, but it is also critical because you will never grow until you do. Okay, so let's open it up for public comment. Let's start on this side of the room. Anybody over here, public comment on this proposal? Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to invite you up. Sorry, I didn't give the instructions. I assume everybody knows. Just come up to the microphone and tell us your name and organization. And
Stephen Forbes, Asheville Museum of Science.
And you'll have 3 minutes.
It's just a question. The $1 million budget number, I know that you've put this plan has been developing for some time. So I don't know for how many years into the future you plan on having this plan. And I wanted to know if you're going to have some way of being able to increase that as the years go by. Is that going to be $1 million this year and for the next 5 years? Or will you have some way of being able to bump that up as this plan grows?
We can obviously, I mean, it's our decision, it's council's decision, so we can bump that up, whenever we want to. But I think, again, the goal of that, the objective of many of these is to help small nonprofits. And when you get to $1 million, you're not a small nonprofit anymore necessarily. So it can always change. I'm not contemplating at this point that we would, increase that every year with inflation or anything like that. It would, maybe after a few years, we would look at that again, but
Okay.
that's not. Okay, Nicole.
Hi there, I'm Nicole Heimbaugh with Bountiful Cities. I just wanted to note that, I guess what I wanted to say is that I think it's really admirable and important that these dollars, while limited, that we have every year in strategic partnership funds, are directed toward closing the achievement gap, the opportunity gap. I just want to note that it's my belief, I haven't seen this written anywhere yet, but it is my belief that the reason why Asheville has the highest achievement gap racially in the state of North Carolina is because Asheville is still experiencing the effects of some of the most detrimental urban renewal policies that took place in the South. And that Asheville actually was the site of more displacement as a result of urban renewal than any, perhaps, other city in the Southeast that also enacted those policies. And I think that those two things are directly related. And so I just want to caution that yes, while we put $200-something thousand a year into the organizations that are desperately working on closing the achievement gap, I want to caution us that those organizations alone will absolutely not be able to close that gap over time. They can do what they can do. They can maybe reduce the gap, but ultimately there are root causes that those organizations addressing after school and mentorship and academic support are not necessarily going to be able to solve on their own. So that's all I wanted to say, is to remember to think about this. And I know y'all are preaching to the choir, but I just wanted it noted. Let's think about this in a larger context of what can be done. Thank you.
And just to remind folks, we had that conversation last year and sort of made that recommendation last year in light of the, at that time, new partnership between the city and the Asheville City Schools aimed at closing the achievement gap. And I'm not involved in that, so I don't know where that partnership is, but I think it does still exist and is still an objective that's moving forward to try to align the resources of both the city and the city school system. Okay, there was somebody else, yes.
Good morning, Mariah Heaney with Mountain BizWorks. I just had one question and one piece that I wanted to make sure got on the record. So I wanted to get clarity if an organization was acting as a fiscal sponsor for a smaller nonprofit or a group that is working together towards their 501c3 status, would they be ineligible to apply as a fiscal sponsor if their budget was over $1 million?
My answer to that is no.
No. Okay, so
Because it's not your money.
it's not our
It's
money,
their
exactly. And so I guess what I'm trying to build clarity for, as if this funding is specifically towards smaller nonprofits or nonprofits that are working towards closing the opportunity gap or the achievement gap. Often larger nonprofits or nonprofits over $1 million in budget, which we are, and we've received this funding before, are working on collaborative projects with other nonprofits on things that could bubble up to become a new 501c3, or sometimes they end up not. But funding like this can allow for new, innovative opportunities that can make really significant dents towards the opportunity gap, but sometimes will not be funded by other projects or opportunities. So it's just something that I would love to put in mind. So maybe, when thinking about this, when thinking about organizations that have more than $1 million in funding, if perhaps they're partnering with smaller nonprofits or partnering in larger groups, but if they have the most capacity to be the agent of fiscal sponsorships to ensure that the funding really is going to all the organizations and the project is moving along, I would implore you guys to think about how that plays into the efficacy of meeting the goals of closing the opportunity gap.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good caution. Anybody else over here? Yeah.
Good morning, Drew Crawford speaking as a resident. A tool that I've seen used in other instances, specifically the Arts and Science Council, that may or may not fit with fiscal year budgeting is in that second, third, fourth, or fifth year of a grant, actually giving a multi-year grant, kind of a aging out grant, so that small organizations, again, I work with small for-profit businesses, and that multi-year budgeting is just really a challenge that they face. And so, if possible, that would be a great tool that might be added at this time. Thank you all.
Yeah, that's actually a good thought generally, is giving us the flexibility. I mean, so the challenge, of course, in giving us the flexibility to do multi-year grants, even just from the get-go, is we can't, it's hard for us to bind future councils, and future councils might zero this whole fund out, so.
But you also minimize the amount of money that comes forward the next year. It's like you say like you give a multi-year grant for 5 years, that's gonna come off the next 5 years of what you're gonna allocate.
Yeah, it's true. It is also true that having multi-year grants allows groups to plan and implement more thoughtfully and strategically, rather than just going year to year not knowing if they're going to get the funding. So I'm a fan of multi-year funding. I mean, I guess if we can do multi-year funding in the contract that we would sign indicates multiple. I mean, can we bind? We can bind through contracts future councils.
You can say that, but then other councils could, you have to put a clause in there or
Yeah.
saying that
Okay.
this could change as a result of funding.
Okay. Okay.
So, unless it's just a contract particularly.
Yeah, well, I think it's the way you're setting up the fund, so if you only have an annual allocation, sometimes when we do multi-year construction contracts or something, you,
Gotcha.
council may have approved the budget that will cover all those years. So it's exactly as you said, you are binding other councils. This is a source of funds that, it sounds like every year, you have to go through the process and decide what you're gonna allocate towards it. So, and maybe the fact that these are a little bit larger grants now, might help the process because people are planning it out for bigger projects.
Yeah, maybe we can look at that and have an answer to that when it goes to council about the degree to which HCD and council could recommend multi-year grants. And I don't know that we would want to recommend a 5-year grant, but, you know, even a 2-year grant can make a big difference. Okay, anybody else on this side? All right.
Before any other community members speak, just going back to the multi-year grant type deal, would we want to give any sort of instruction on how to explore that?
Well, I think what I meant to do, if I didn't do it, was ask either Paul or Kathy or Janice to be able to report back to us on our authority to do that. So the process here, Keith, we're going to vote on these today, and then they'll go to council and be on our agenda for February 11th. So there's information that we don't have today that we can have available to us at that conversation, but we need that timeline in order, because the
Do we already have this on our,
applications.
I'm sorry, the disbursements for the SPF and CDBG funds, do we already have a tentative date set for that? I can't remember, I don't think we do.
I want to say it is
Was it
February 28th.
February
I
20th.
mean,
No,
I'm sorry,
March. So CDB,
March 28th.
well, but SPF is April,
Okay.
I believe.
But the application process is already,
But it
Yeah,
is
underway.
not.
Yeah.
We're waiting for the approval on these items, and then it goes to city council on February the 11th for a full vote, and then after that, it will go out to
Right.
everyone to be able to apply.
normally it probably would have been underway though, wouldn't
It
it?
would be.
Yeah, so we split CDBG from SPF. Okay, public comment from over here on this, anyone? D, oh, actually Celeste, I'm so sorry. Are you doing okay on time? You're fine, okay, D, come on up.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, is this just for Asheville City Schools or education? Is that the jargon? I know that they interchange opportunity gap with the achievement gap, or does it pertain to other nonprofits or NGOs in our community that provide services?
You want to answer how we're going to review that? For me, it's the opportunity gap.
Kathy, use your microphone, sorry.
Thank you. So we had been working on an agreement with Asheville City Schools, but with the change in superintendent, I don't think that that's been fully executed at this point. So I think that at this point, we're pretty open to being able to look at, from our perspective, unless directed different by council, we're looking at closing the opportunity gap for individuals. And if it is a program with the Asheville City Schools, we want folks to be able to demonstrate, whoever they're working with, that there's metrics and I'm preaching to the choir now, that there's metrics and data that demonstrate how that's happening.
Right.
But it doesn't mean, Dee, that I think there will be groups that are working and have programs to help close that gap that are not necessarily working hand in hand with the city school system.
Okay, so basically, I'm a data-driven person. And based on the data that we got from the Youth Justice Project and the DPI, that achievement gap has gotten wider than ever. You've got a pipeline, was on the phone with them in Durham. You've got a pipeline of charter school applications for this city that's gonna literally eviscerate the Asheville City Schools and public education. Also, I don't know, I guess what is happening in the community, pretty much everybody's kind of discouraged because of the lack of results in everything that we've got. Whether it's economic development, business development, whatever it is, we got the worst data sets. We've just got one back for housing from our software engineers this week. That'll be at the housing fair, I think on Saturday, a portion. But it has grown steadily worse and worse. Like Nicole said, the urban renewal movement that decimated our capital is the main problem. But the thing about it is there gonna be a rubric so that these decisions are not, we're all human. We're all subject to just, who we know, and I know how business is. We do business with people we know. Is there a rubric that these applications will be judged by, and will that rubric be published before and along with the specifications for the proposals? Also, I wanted to ask another question with that. Is this any way involved with Buncombe County's strategic partnership funding, or is it a separate process?
Separate process.
Okay, and what about the rubric? Is there one? There's been so little performance metrics of just about every NGO that the city deals, especially when it comes to folks dealing in my community. When you got sick people, you want the best doctors you can find. You don't deal with quacks, and you don't deal with people that are not held to high standards. And we're reaping the wind for it right now. So I guess that's why I'm just a little perturbed. When I hear change, I know that there has to be disruption. No change that brings positive results, especially for poor people, is not a non-disruptive event. Let me just assure you that we have the worst data sets of any African-American community in North Carolina. There is a reason for that. And if it's man-made, it can be disassembled by men and women who know what they're doing. So I would say to you that if you don't have rubrics that go out with the specifications of the proposal summary where everybody can see them and that everybody's ticking off or trying to hit, like Buncombe County just thought to do, by the way, you're going to have a process that's highly political. And, you know, everybody knows who they know, and, you know, politicism and cronyism comes into it. So I just see where our community is just being slowly destroyed. And, you know, I looked at my tax bill the other day. I paid, I guess it's about $2,700 for the house over in Kenilworth. And we're not getting a whole lot of bang for our buck. So I would hope that y'all do something different. It's not working.
Thanks. Maybe we can look at what Buncombe County is doing if they, great. Celeste.
Good morning, I'm Celeste Collins with On Track Financial Education and Counseling. Our budget is $1.2 million, so we would not be eligible for strategic partnership funding under these new guidelines. We have strategic partnership funding for our VITA site, our free income tax preparation site. Last year, we helped 926 people, and that resulted in over $1 million in tax refunds, and we didn't charge anything. We cobbled together funding to be able to staff and pay the rent and have the computers available to provide these services. And our average household income is under $25,000. That said, is there a place where strategic partnership projects such as our VITA site can go for support from the city to continue to provide these types of services? I heard CDBG mentioned, and we do apply for CDBG for a different set of programs, the things that help people improve their credit, that help people learn how to buy homes, that really target helping people build home equity to work towards addressing some of the racial wealth gap. So that would be my question is where do we go? Because it's a very important project, and there, 80% of the people who come to our site are Asheville City residents, and we've had the program in place since 2006.
Yeah. Anybody else over here? All right. So I think we should vote on these one at a time. Is that hard to do? What do y'all think? Or as opposed to a package? Well, let's just go through them. So
Before we vote, because I don't want to forget.
yeah, and I should ask, is there more discussion here?
Back to the multi-year, the gentleman that brought up the multi-year grant thing. As far as it being coming off of future budgets, I mean, we could also, if it's decided to even go that route. If you decide to do a multi-year grant, allocate out the funds already existing and set it aside, it would just not be, it would just come off of what you allocate that year as opposed to future councils being bound to something. So for instance, if we make a 3-year grant for $60,000 at a max of $20,000 a year, we just take that $60,000 out of what's in that SPF process for that budget year, and then it just follows the applicant. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
What I'm
That
saying?
makes more sense,
Yeah.
because then you know the amount of funds you've allocated, so you're not tapping into the future year's allocations, you're just saying, taking more out of the budget that you have.
Right.
Right, so it's like 60,000 instead of whatever the max is proposed now.
Right.
I mean, that certainly is an option. I would be worried that that would take too much, you know, that would take 60,000 out of a small pot as opposed to taking 20,000 out of a larger pot.
I mean, it was just an example
Yeah, no,
for whatever, you could
yeah.
cap it or whatever, but just spitballing on that. And then, secondly, should this, all of this or portions of this move on to council? I would just, like to have representatives from equity and inclusion be able to be here to answer questions. I find it really odd that they were part of the memo back in June and they're not here today. I just don't know why they're not here, that's all. So it would be good for council members, including myself, to be able to ask questions on the dais.
All right, so just to go through these one more time. So the first one, limiting the number of years that organizations can receive SPF grants to 5 years. Our recommendation is that that is a guideline, that sort of a default, but could be, funding could be longer than that if the committee and council recommended it. The second one, limit on organizational budget to $1 million. Third, grants are going to be given out in these chunks, and I think, Kathy, so just correct me if I'm wrong, I think what we're saying there is organizations apply for one of these amounts, and then we basically are taking away our discretion to say, well, you know, we're running out of money, so instead of 10,000, they've asked for 10, but we're going to give them 7,500. Like we're taking that away from ourselves. You get one of these chunks, and it may be that someone applies for 15, but we give them 10. But we're doing away with the $1,666 grants. Okay, I think this also it should make it easier for organizations, but certainly also staff capacity. Applicants must demonstrate that the grant will close the opportunity gap, so the recommendation is that it focus on that particular aspect, as opposed to, I think right now we have, 6 criteria? You could come in under 6 different criteria, and now we're saying there's one. There's just one. Staff won't move forward complete applications, but council will, you will send us the initial applications. Is that going to be when they come in? Is that when that's going to happen? Or at the time of decision, you will send us the initial application and then the final?
That was our recommendation,
Okay.
is that when we send you the packet with our recommendation, it will include the initial application.
Plus the final, okay. And then staff will make recommendations on funding, which doesn't happen now. Organizations receiving a $10,000 grant or more must attend capacity building training provided by the city or others. And then, I guess we don't want to put on here as a requirement, but you're also going to explore the multi-use grant, multi-year grant option, so.
Got something else.
Yeah.
The metric that would, I think Ms. Williams brought up a good point. The metric that would hold organizations accountable, what does success look like? So we want to close the opportunity gap, and we want to give this money toward good efforts, but what are we using to determine what success looks like, and does success actually equal success? I know that kind of sounds really weird, but like what we may deem successful may not necessarily be successful to closing an opportunity gap. So we need to figure that out before we just kind of dedicate this whole process. I'm with it, but we need to figure out what success looks like, and does it align with the school system, and does it actually equal success, or is it just us trying to say like, okay, if we make the bar this high, we might actually need to get here. This may be successful for us, but we're nowhere close to the bar, so let's try to figure that part out as well.
Well, maybe that's worth a little bit of conversation between and among us. It seems like, so to Nicole's point, no one or even the collection of these organizations can close the opportunity gap. So, and each organization is going to have their own little piece of it. Sometimes it's after school homework, sometimes it's, mentorship and self, confidence building and all of that. And it seems to be, to me, each one of those does have its piece, and that maybe really all we can measure is how successful each group is at doing what they said they were going to
think also, you mentioned what each group can do. I don't necessarily dispel that, but I would say if we're trying to close the opportunity gap, I think we should have some high-level educators in here to say what, you know, are these organizations doing something good toward our outcome? And if they're not part of that conversation, which seems like they would need to be, then what is the point? Like, if we're not going to include them and saying this definitely is gonna move the needle, if we're not gonna do that, then we're just playing games.
It's something that we should present to the Equity Collaborative. And that's the group that, we have several stakeholders, but they're working with Asheville City Schools around strategies to use in the classroom and curriculum based. So if we present this to them, and I think we did something similar last year, but I don't think it was integrated in our process.
There was a recommendation, as I recall, or there was information in what came to us about whether these groups worked with the Asheville City School System. Was that, so that was just that, and then there wasn't a judgment from the schools, from the Asheville City School System about whether the work was effective or not. It was just, we're working with them or we're not. Is that?
Also,
So hang on just a second. So are you asking for maybe a little bit more of a qualitative analysis from folks at the school system or the collaborative? Is that what you call
I
it?
think the collaborative can give us a good idea about some success indicators.
Success indicators.
Their recommendations on success indicators,
Okay.
and then we can use that as a base.
Yeah.
Or we can use that as just a representation of a voice or perspective,
Right.
and adding a couple more layers to it. But I believe that there needs to be some type of reporting mechanism between organizations and the schools, whether it's around their model development, whether it's around academic achievement or behavioral type of, wraparounds. But this thing is multi-layered, so we have to have multiple voices to give us a good base of where our dollar is going and if it's successful.
So what I heard there is get some input from the collaborative on metrics, or what did you call them? Success indicators. And then how would we, again, we can ask the same question of the school system, of these groups that have applied for this funding, who are you working with? And maybe we could even ask for, some input on how effective they view those programs as being in the school system. Would that be helpful?
Yep, and then we're also going to follow up with Buncombe County to see
Right.
how they're rating success.
Anything else that comes to mind about that issue?
The school system is so audited by these educators. Is that the collaborative, is that what it is?
The collaborative is for, it's not just limited to childhood education. There are different practitioners from maybe UNCA who have a lens on racial equity. They have a stake in some people who are in the higher education realm as well. So maybe we can bring some information about the collective resume of that group, so we'll know if that's the best source.
Anybody know anything about money? You got anybody in that collaborative that does that? Economic development? Because poverty is systemic and it's a core.
I see where you're going, and I think we need to learn more because I'm not an expert on their process. I can just give you a little bit of information about the direction they're going, but, let's learn some more information. I think Deborah is facilitating
She's
that.
facilitating that group. We were just talking about our ability to get in front of them before February the 11th, because I think they may be waiting on the new superintendent. I don't know the schedule
So
of what they're doing.
I didn't take that conversation to say we have to have those things in place before we vote on this criteria. I think we need to have these things in place before we make our decisions. Is that what you were saying?
Well,
Okay.
the only thing I would say is that I feel in fairness to the folks submitting applications, if I were them, I would want to know what those
Sure.
are before I submit applications.
So the other way to approach it is, you know, if that can't happen, my guess is, you know, anytime you make a big change like this, you're gonna be tweaking it going forward. And that, you know, if we don't have everything we might wanna have in place this year, that doesn't mean that we still don't go forward with some, with some measure of change on this front, and we can figure it out as we go. So, okay, sorry, you had one more thing, or you had another thing.
It doesn't necessarily, it kind of touches on this, but it doesn't. The strategic partnership funds are separate from other organizations that are being funded through our regular budget process that doesn't have to go through any other criteria, but say that they actually help close the opportunity gap. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, even though they're not a part of this process, if we're gonna do something like this, we need to hold those other organizations accountable as well that do not have to go through any sort of process, that actually receive right now more than what our maximum amount would be allowed. So I'm not sure how I want to address that, because this isn't necessarily the venue, since it's strategic partnership funds we're talking about.
I don't know.
But I think we all know that there are organizations in our regular budget process that doesn't have to go through any sort of
Right.
process to get funded.
I'm just thinking off the top of my head, the one that comes to mind is Asheville City Schools Foundation and IRL. That's just embedded in our budget, right? And does anybody remember how much?
40,000 at last load.
Okay.
And I think the sports commission is one, I think we have the EDC.
No, I mean the focus on the opportunity
Oh,
gap.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, right, yeah. No, we have others, Bountiful Cities, Greenworks, all those,
Yeah.
but,
Okay.
I can't think of any other one that focuses on the opportunity gap. But in those agreements, I mean, Keith makes a good point. So I know that when we have funding that's embedded in our budget for these organizations, we have contracts with them. They're essentially performance agreements, right? But are those performance agreements that are about outputs or outcomes, I guess is my question. Yeah, right. And to the degree that we're requiring things of these applicants, requiring the same thing of those, I think makes a lot of
Right.
sense. Yeah. All right, so what's the general, well, first of all, any other discussion?
These are meritful recommendations, given the different things that popped up, especially with the accountability part. I'm not ready. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm not ready to recommend this to council and have council vote on this without any of the important answered questions. Not saying that we can't move forward in this fiscal year with our strategic partnership funds and asking organizations to only apply to close the opportunity gap. I'm a bit conflicted on where I want to go personally.
So would it make a difference then to vote on, I mean, there are probably some on here that you might not,
I mean,
that you're not conflicted about, but then some maybe you are, so.
Really, it's not even for me, it's really not even about that per se. It's the fact that we want to recommend this to council with the meeting coming up. When is this going to go on the council agenda? February the 11th. That's like right around the corner, but we have a couple of unanswered questions. We have some things that seem very important to me, and I don't feel comfortable making recommendations putting this in front of council, and we not even kind of cleaned up everything that we've talked about here. It feels a bit rushed. I mean, there's been work on this for quite some time period, but as far as getting it in front of council and making it,
So
the
what
end
would,
all, it seems a bit rushed.
so if we, and and I want to come back to what the unanswered questions are, but if we push the timetable out so that maybe we had one more meeting on it in February and it went to council at the end of February, what does that do to the timeline, the application timeline? I mean, can we, I guess what I'm asking is, what happens if we bump the application timeline out a month?
It's just, I think the main thing is we're up against getting everything into the budget. Usually, I think they want us to have all of these funding decisions wrapped up, I think at the latest in May as it moves to the budget. And so there's just that concern to make sure people, when the application opens, have enough time to respond to it, and then get it back in time for the decision-making to happen, and then get it through so it can be moved forward in this year's budget.
The one thing that would be helpful is, so your meeting is scheduled for the 18th of February. If you moved your meeting
Push it up.
to the 11th, then that would, yeah, if you moved HCD next month to the 11th, and I don't know, I'm looking at what that does to other items on the agenda, then we could come back to you. It's a council day, but it would be a 10.
Right.
Then we would have time, because the meeting that we would need to get it on is the 25th of February. So that would give staff the time to be able to move and get everything pulled together for the February 25th agenda. And Keith, at that meeting, we could make sure and have folks from the Equity and Inclusion Office at the HCD meeting if we move it to the 11th of February.
And if we did that, would we have to shift then at all the application period?
Yes.
Or, so what's the proposed application opening or announcement date, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
So right now, I believe we have the application and we sent out notifications for applications due February 21st with a due date of March 27th. So we could probably move that to the 28th, probably keep the due date of March 27th, but it's still a month, which I hopefully be clear to everybody.
Yeah.
Want to double check with Megan Gaskell to see if there's if I'm getting those dates right, which I think I am. Yes.
Okay, so we would just be pushing the announcement date by a week, but organizations would still have 4.5 weeks to do their applications, which again, seems reasonable. Not unusual, I would just say, in the foundation world. Okay, so does that,
Yeah.
okay, so, and does moving the meeting to the 11th work for both of you?
As long as it's in the morning, I've got governance and.
Yeah. Yeah, so same time, 10 o'clock. So if you guys can send out, do calendar changes for us, that would be great. Actually, I don't think we have calendar invitations for this meeting, so that would be awesome if we can get those.
So I want to just clarify the information that we will bring back. We're going to be coming back with looking at a multi-year funding option. We're going to be discussing the ability to have criteria or matrix, some kind of a rubric.
Also, what organizations that have received funding in the past, or let's say in the last 2 years, would not be eligible under the threshold. The organizations and the programs that they get funding for.
And were there any, we'll make sure and have equity and inclusion staff at the meeting. Was there anything else?
Yes, the ability, so the communication with someone at the school system to figure out if, I guess it goes along with the metrics, but what does success look like based on these organizations? How can they provide success?
All right, so those essentially kind of 3 things, I think. Okay, anything else? Okay. All right, well then, so we will deal with this again on the 11th. And thank you for your flexibility and creativity, staff. All right, so I think that's it for our agenda except for general public comment. So I'll now open it up to general public comment if anybody has any. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm again Nicole Heimbaugh from Bountiful Cities. I wanted to say two things really quickly. One is I know you are receiving staff updates, but I wanted to personally give you an update about the Asheville Buncombe Community Land Trust. We did just hire our first interim part-time executive director, which is a major deal for us, and it means that we'll be able to begin to steward properties this year. So she's coming in at the end of January, and we're going to get her oriented, and she'll begin right away. So that's exciting. The other thing I wanted to let you all maybe marinate on, certainly no decisions today. I think that thinking about the power of bond funding in order to address longstanding issues is really an important tool, and I think we'll look back and see how useful it was for affordable housing and things like that after this current bond period ends. I would like to encourage us to think, again, outside the box about those ongoing fairly disastrous effects of our urban renewal policies, and is it possible to issue bond funds to address some of those ongoing effects? I know the word reparation is, not bandied about lightly, but a bond for urban renewal reparation might be really interesting. And I think it's going to take that kind of money to actually make a significant impact on the opportunity gap. Thanks.
Anybody else? All right, then we stand adjourned. Thanks.